Salam Aleykom. Welcome to my library tour, the library of a 23-year-old Iranian Sunni Muslim convert. Many people have asked me to do this library tour and show people my books. So yeah, here are some of my books. So let's start. This is the Masnavi of Maulana Jalaluddin al-Rumi. This is a book by a former Iranian Shia scholar, not by, about him. He's called Ali Akbar Hakemizadeh. You can see him here in his Shia clergy clothes. He was a friend of a religious reformist called Ahmad Kasravi, and together they wrote books and published a newspaper in refutation of superstition, especially Shiism. And he wrote a small pamphlet called Asrar Hezar Saleh, which is translated to the 1,000-year-old secret. And in it was basically a points of refutation of Shiism as practiced in Iran in the early 19th century. And Khomeini's first book, Kashf Asrar, is actually in reference to this book, a refutation of this and other Iranian Shia reformists, which means the unveiling of the secret. Here is the Quran in Hafs recitation, and this is a Quran in Warsh recitation that my friend gifted to me. Divan Hafez, an Iranian Sunni poet. His tomb is located in Shiraz, a small pocket-sized Quran. Shahnameh, which is the Book of Kings. This is small mythological stories of the history of Iran in Farsi. Shia-gari, Sufi-gari, Baha'i-gari by Ahmad Kasravi. He was the friend of Hakemizadeh, and he is famous for his refutations of basically all the religions in Iran, and especially Shiism and Sufism. He was a former Shia scholar and famous academic. He mastered many fields in history, linguistics, religion, philosophy, and even though he was against Tashayyu Shiism, he was a staunch defender of theism. He hated atheism and refuted it staunchly. His book Shiism, or Shia-gari, has actually been translated to English, and it's published in a volume together with his essays on Islam called Ahmad Kasravi on Shiism and Islam. Here's a picture of it. He was actually assassinated while in court by Islamist thugs, by a terrorist group called Fadayan Islam, which was actually a group that Ayatollah Borghei, a former Shia scholar, was a part of in his youth, which he later left. Divan Shams Tabriz by Nicholson, a famous Iranian Orientalist. This is Divan Hafez, a beautiful leather bound. Golden with Farsi and the English translation. Interestingly, when the Shias conquered Iran, they tried to destroy his tomb in Shiraz, but his supporters made up and started fabricating poems in his name that made him look like a Shia to save his grave. This is the Shahnameh. I think it's actually parts of Shahnameh. I don't believe this is the entire Shahnameh in English. I go down here. What is Shia Reform in Iran? The life and theology of Sharit Sangelaji. He was one of the major Shia scholars of his time in the early rule of Reza Shah. And he refuted Shiism, the grave worship ziyarats, and called these innovations, and yeah, He's a famous Shia reformist that actually preached in the biggest mosque of the entirety of Tehran. He was a friend of Reza Shah, or not a friend, but Reza Shah actually liked this guy because he was against khurafat and superstition. And when Tagore, the famous Bengali philosopher that won the Nobel Literature Prize, came to Iran, Reza Shah actually arranged a debate between Shariat Sangelaji and Tagore, which, according to the translation, it seems like Shariat won, or Sangelaji won. And this is a book by Ali Rahnama, where he basically talks about the life and theology and theology of Shariat Sangelaji. Kalam, Cosmological Arguments by Muhammad Hijab. Social Justice in Islam by Sayyid Qutb, translated by Hamid Algar, which seems to be an English convert to Shiism and staunch Islamist. He has also translated some books of Ali Shariati, and according to the studies of Ervand Abrahamian, this guy here, he mentions that in the translations made by Hamid Algar, he has removed the parts which is critical to the Shia clergy of Iran, because in his book, in this book on socialism in Islam, because Ali Shariati was not only a critic of Imamism and the Ashura ceremony and the clergy, so those parts of the lecture that has been transcribed and translated by Hamid Algar has actually been censored and removed. Or instead of, when he says the clergy, he says the elders. So yeah, Hamid Algar is famous for his terrible translations, basically, and his bias. And from what I have understand about this book is that Sayyid Qutb actually made Tawbah from it, and the only reason I have it is because it's super expensive, but I managed to find it in an Indian publisher that made it just available for third world sales. Let's see if we can find it, but it says in this book that is not to be sold except in a few countries, so because of the cheap price I bought it, but I haven't read it yet. Let's see if I can make it. Okay. Islam Between West and East by East and the West by the former Bosnian president Alija Izetbegović. The Problem of Philosophy, which is basically talks about how we can't be sure about anything, and he uses a table as an example, like how if you look at one angle of the table it looks one way, so when if you look above, from the right, from the left, and both way or both like sides are true visions of the table. And yeah. This is Lessons from Surah Al-Kahf by Dr. Yasser Qadi. He has also released lessons from Surah Yusuf. The Unromantic Orient by Muhammad Asad, a Jewish convert to Islam. This was actually before he converted to Islam. This is when he worked as a journalist and documented his trips in the Orient. And it was basically like short paragraphs of text that he sent to the newspaper that was published. So this is a collection of what he said. Bosnia, A Short History, where it basically talks about where Bosnians came from, how they converted to Islam, and the modern history. The Iranian Mujahideen, which is a book about the Mujahideen Khalq, the biggest political party after the Iranian Revolution, and how they were funded, their ideology, and their history, and what happened after the Iranian Revolution, how come they went from being the most popular party to basically a sect or a cult. The Travels of Ibn Jubayr by Roland Broadhurst, Orientalist translation, but really interesting. He talks about like the shrines he visited in Cairo and his travels of Hajj and everything. Hajj by Dr. Ali Shariati. the origins of Islamic law, the Quran, the Muwatta, and Medini and Amal. Ibn Battuta, I bought this by mistake. I thought this was actually the travels of Ibn Battuta, but yeah, it was a book about his travels and Battuta. This is The Miserable Revolution and Shia, a Critical Revision by Dr. Musa al-Musawi. Dr. Musa al-Musawi was the grandson of Abu Hassan Esfahani, which was the biggest Shia scholar of his time and the only scholar of Shiism at that time that reached the level of Marja. And basically, this book, The Miserable Revolution, is a refutation of the Iranian Revolution, because he knew everyone involved and he was active in politics and religion. So this is a refutation of the Iranian Revolution, and this book is a refutation of Shia scholarship and how Shia scholarship is actually the cause of the splitting between Sunni and Shia Muslims, or specifically Sunnis and Twelver Muslims, or Twelver Shias. He says that they're like hatred from Sahaba and cursing and innovations are all the doings of the enemies of Islam that try to split the Muslims. And he uses the Zaydis as an example for how Sunnis and Shias can work together and basically be friends, even though they see Ali as the rightful caliph. But just because of the cursing and the hatred that the Shia clergy spews, there can't be any unity between Sunnis and Twelvers, but there can be unity between the Zaydis and Sunnis. And therefore he says that Shia should put away these crazy beliefs and be more like the Zaydis. And actually, he praises the Salafis quite a lot in this book. It's an interesting read. The Short History of the Ismailis by Farhad Daftari. Basically, it talks about the history and theology of Ismailism, which is really interesting. It used to be the biggest sect of Shiism, but today is obscure, located into a couple of parts of the world, mainly Pakistan, India, and Yemen, and parts of Saudi Arabia. Aliyah Azbegwich again, Notes from Prison, really interesting book, basically a collection of all his notes. Marxism and Other Western Fallacies, an Islamic Critique, also translated by Hamid Algar. According to research and the friends of Ali Shariati, it doesn't seem like Ali Shariati actually wrote this book. It seems to be in a book written by the Iranian Secret Service to discredit Ali Shariati, because it's really weak in its refutation and it presents a very bad view, or very bad. It shows that he doesn't have any real knowledge of the West. This is Woman Around the Prophet's Heart, where he basically talks about the woman that the Prophet ﷺ loved, by Ali Shariati, translated by Leila Bakhtiyar, that died a couple of years ago. Her translations are much, much better than the translations of Hamid Algar. And Ali Shariati talks about how Aisha was 9 years old in this book, which makes me believe that the idea that she wasn't 9 years old is probably a modern belief, that she has just recently has started to believe. And he explains that there wasn't like any sexual attraction between him and Aisha, and it was more like a spiritual love. And he talks about Khadija and other women. The Self of a Muslim and Its Inner Peace. I bought it in Turkey. I thought it might be interesting to read some Sufi literature from Turkey. Mazhab Ali Mazhab, also I think translated by Leila Bakhtiyar. Great book, based on his lectures, Ali Shariati's lectures, where he basically talks about how religion has been used by the governments and states to control people. And he basically gives also an Islamic explanation to the religion is the opium of the people. Great book. Shia sects by Naubakhti. It's a 12-er book about Shia sects that developed after the death of each of the 12 imams. Great book, which shows the confusion within Shiism about who is the real imam. and that people actually didn't really know, and what happened to the sects and everything. Edward Said, Orientalism, which is a important book if you want to be, if you're a Muslim and going to go into academia, especially if you're going to study like Islam or the Middle East. Extremely important. Let's go up here. The Sirah of Ibn Kathir, in English. The Sirah of Prophet Muhammad by Ibn Kathir, I'm sorry. The biography of Muhammad Sallam by Martin Ling. I actually bought this in Turkey, and it has 2 different prices. If you look, let's see if this can focus. See if my camera can focus. There we go. $30 and 50 liras, which is like 50 liras, like $5, I think. So it's 2 different prices. So I said I have to buy it. It's actually Turkish and English. So 1 page is Turkish, 1 page is English. Muhammad, the Prophet of Peace Among Clash of Empires, and it's by Juan Cole. It's a Orientalist translation, Orientalist biography of Prophet Muhammad, where he basically puts his life and work in the context of the Sasanian Roman wars that were happening at his time. And interestingly, he actually says that he can't believe that Muhammad was illiterate because of him partaking in like being a merchant and traveling to Syria and everything. So it's a really interesting book. Really interesting. I recommend it for everyone to read. The Sealed Nectar, everyone knows about it. The Sword of Allah by Khalid ibn al-Walid by General A.I. Akram. The Muslim Conquest of Persia by the same guy. And A.I. Akram was a Pakistani general that was tired of reading books about the West or Western generals, so he decided to write books about Muslim generals and Muslim conquest as an alternative, and these books were actually used to teach future generals and military personnel. He has written multiple books, for example, Muslim conquest of Egypt and Syria, and North Africa, I think also, and the Falcon of Quraysh, Muslim conquest of Spain. But these books unfortunately haven't been republished. They were published once, it seems, by the Pakistani military something, and these books are published by Maktaba. And I have talked to the owner of the Maktaba, and he said that they will inshallah publish the rest of the series. But until then, these 2 volumes is the only thing we have. An Introduction to the Science of the Quran by Yasir Qadi. The Quran in Swedish, which is basically a translation of Muhammad Asad's Quran and commentary. Al-Adab al-Mufrad. There we go. Adab al-Mufrad by Imam Bukhari. Tafsir Jalalain by Imam Suyuti. The History of the Caliphs, Imam Suyuti. Basically the entire series of Khulafa al-Rashidin by Dr. Salabi, except the book about Hussein. Men and Women Around the Messenger, a Swedish Orientalist Quran translation. The Meaning of the Quran by Maududi, who was actually one of the founders of the Medina University. The Art of Rhetoric, which is basically a modern commentary of Aristoteles, The Art of Persuasion, or Aristotle's, rhetoric, with the introduction by Hamza Youssef. It's part of the books that I study in Zaytuna College. The history of the Quranic text by Muhammad Al-Azami, which basically talks about the Quran and how it was written down and compares to the Bible. Was recommended by Farid al-Bahraini to me. And this is also a book by Azami, where it talks about studies in Hadith methodology and literature text, where it basically talks about how the science of Hadith developed and its history. Here is a book by Ibn Taymiyyah, The Right Way, which was a summarized translation. I wouldn't recommend it, it's a bad book. Maybe the original Arabic one is great, but this one, it might be good for a new Muslim, but I didn't really benefit from it. This is the same book, Studies in Hadith Methodology, but revised edition and modern print. I think this is from the 90s maybe. This is more later. Muhammad, the Ideal Prophet, where it basically talks about Muhammad and the comparison to different prophets to prove that he is the ideal prophet. The Battle of Qadisiyah, Aqidah al-Tahawiyah, great Aqidah book. Apostate by Yorham van Klaven. I haven't read it yet, but it's a great book. It's a former Islamophobe in the West that was tried to ban Islam, that actually converted to Islam while writing a book against Islam, thanks to getting into contact with Hamza Yusuf and other traditional Sunni scholars. The Martyrdom of Imam Hussein by Farid al-Bahraini. Here we go to the books I'm currently reading, or the books on my second shelf. Mine Yahtadul al-Faqih, which is one of the main books of the Shia. They have 4 main books. This is one of them. Usul al-Kafi. This is part of the Kafi series, 2 volumes. He has Furu and other parts of the Kafi. I just have the Usul part. Al-Mawrid, Arabic to English dictionary. Memoirs of an Ottoman Prince. I saw this while in Turkey, but unfortunately I didn't have the baggage space to bring it home, or the money. I bought so many other books. So when I got home, I ordered it from Amazon. Basically, it's the memoirs of one of the last Ottoman princes about life in the end of the Ottoman Empire. And Topkapi Palace, Natural Balagha of Imam Ali, Arabic and English translation. I doubt it that he read it, or that Ali wrote it. Basically seems like a rant of a madman. All he does is curse other people and the people of Basra and different cities, and yeah. Slavery in Islam by Jonathan Brown. On the Sociology of Islam by Ali Shariati, that's by Hamid Aligar. That has probably been really like edited and fit to fit his Khomeini's narrative. The Sasanian Empire, The Rise and Fall of an Empire by Dr. Turajer Daryai, a guy I really look up to, and I devour all his lectures on Iranian history. It's interesting that he talks about like how, thanks to the Shia clergy and Shiism, the Iranians have a skewed picture of early Islamic rule in Iran. And it talks about how the Umayyads actually didn't oppress Iranians, and how that they used to be allies. But because of the Shia scholars that want to paint a bad picture of the Umayyads, they don't really talk about that. The Meccan Uprising, a really interesting book by Nasir al-Huzaymi, which was basically, he was basically a friend of Juhayman that took over Mecca. The English translation of his biography and his time with the Salafi, or the Salafi group, as they called, the Ikhwan. And he talks about like the people and what kind of people that was attracted to his group, and what they used to do, and what books they read and stuff like that. And he actually mentions that in his book there are still people that believe that the guy that was claimed to be the Mahdi is the Mahdi, and is not dead. He's hiding somewhere in Yemen and they're waiting his return. It reminds me of the Aqidah of Shiism. So I could actually imagine that if these 2 people manages to maybe get control of a kingdom, they could probably spread that idea that the Mahdi is in Yemen somewhere in hiding, and bam, you have a new religion. Especially like in the medieval times, I can imagine like something taking hold and spreading, and yeah. I recommend everyone to read this book. And he talks about like how the Salafis collected books. They didn't read them, they just collected Aqidah books and Hadith books, and how actually Al-Albani was a close friend of Juhayman and the Salafi group and supporter of them. Concise Manual of Marriage, like a book every Salafi have to read, by Ibn Uthaymeen. the things that nullify one's Islam, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, with commentary by Fawzan, I think, yeah. Liquid Modernity, a critique of modernity, recommended by Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. The Wahhabi myth basically blames all the problems of terrorism on Sufis. Kitab al-Tawheed, The Pillars of Iman in Islam, by Ibn Zeno, a Syrian scholar. Caliphate, a Sultanate in Medieval Persia, is a PhD dissertation by Siddiqui, and in it he talks about basically the relation between early Persian states, Sunni Muslim states, and the relation to the Caliphate. English translation of the Quran, Orientalist commentary of Rumi's Mahtanawi by Nicholson, 2 volumes. Here they are. I'm using gimbal, so sometimes it has its own life. Sorry for that. The Noble Quran, really good English translation of the Quran. Basic, I'll show it, because in it he basically splits up like the sections of the Quran, like Moses. Let's see if we can focus. For example, Moses and the magicians face off. Magicians become believers. So it's good for a beginner to like see, okay, now this is a story about that, now it's a story about that, instead of like some other translation where the text just continues and like people can be confused about what's happening now. Why does it change like subject and everything? Bigger, lean, and stronger for people that work out like me. The Good Immigrant, basically a collection of essays about being an immigrant. Proclaim Your Heart in Swedish was gifted by a friend to me. Saviors of the Islamic Spirit. I bought it when Abdurrahman ibn Yusuf al-Maghira came to Sweden and had a lecture. So I bought it as lecture. Unfortunately, it doesn't have like the biography of Rumi and other scholars, but yeah, it still has a lot of scholars like Hassan al-Basri, Abdul Aziz, Imam Ghazali, Nuruddin al-Zingi, and others. The history of Islam. I don't know. It's good. It has some facts about like dynasties and kingdoms that isn't really available in English, but it doesn't have any single references. So might as well throw it down the toilet. To be honest, the difference. Fiqh al-Iman, the key proof of Hanafi fiqh by Maqir. Also the difference of the Imams, differences. So it basically talks about the differences of Imam Hans Wehr, Arabic English translation. The first book in English I bought, really that started my quest for knowledge, was this book, Lost Islamic History. The Republic by Plato, The Prince by Machiavelli. Now we go down here. The 7 military classic of ancient China. Christian theology, Decline and Fall of the Sasanian Empire. Arabic grammar, The Status of the Souls, which is a book by Fethullah Gulen, the guy that tried to do a coup in Turkey. Islamic Fundamentalism, Answer to History, by the former king of Iran. Inviting Christians to Monotheism by Mustafa Muhammad Tabatabai. Basically a refutation of Christianity and an invitation to Tawheed. He was also a former Shia scholar, or that was a friend of Ayatollah Burqi. And this is a book that he has written to like call back the millions of people that has left Islam for Christianity in Iran. Zoroastrianism. I think, this is 2 small essays by Mount Hijab, a treatise on liberal critiques of Rida, Fifth Way Feminism, Aristotle's The Art of Rhetoric, which is basically the original text, and that book up there was a commentary or like explanation of it. Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, which is atheist biohistory of mankind, where he basically sees humankind as animals, and why we of all animals were the ones that developed and basically conquered the world. Pandemic by Zizek. People talked about him as being one great of Marxist philosopher. So I said, let's read his book and see what he has to say. Animal Farm, George Orwell, great book. But you could basically read any book about any revolution and get the same message. But this is for the Western people that don't have time to read real books about revolutions. So it brings basically how revolutions usually happen and presents them as animals. 1984, the very short introduction to logic, Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, Dante's The Thing About Hell, The Inferno, Friedrich Nietzsche, this is also Nietzsche and Plato, and this is Socrates' Defense. This is a book I'm reading currently, Ibn Rushd's commentary on Plato's Republic. This is a Swedish book called The Big Sex Experiment or Gender Experiment, where basically he talks about the author, that's the professor in Gothenburg University, about how there is actually a difference between men and females, and this is a big experiment and a waste of money that people in the West are doing with all this gender stuff. The Moors After Spain by Stanley Lane Poole, American Orientalist. I expected the book to be about what happened to the Muslims after Spain, but it seems to be about the history of pirates, Muslim pirates after Spain. Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, summarized. Qayrawani's Risala on Fiqh, Maliki Fiqh. A book I'm using for a paper, where I'm basically talking about how, depending of who writes the biography of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, what they are focused on and what they are leaving out. And speaking of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab's biography, in this book he actually talks about Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab because Sangalaji dies 40 years. Sangalaji is born 40 years after the death of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, and Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab actually spends a couple of years in Iran. So he talks about if there is any connection between Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab and Sangalaji, which is something some Shias claim. This is a beautiful copy of what's called Qasid al-Burda, but it has some crazy stories about how to use the Burda as protections and khurafati stuff, which really disappointed me, but yeah, hey, what can you expect? Commentary, Ottoman commentary of oh no, my phone is lagging. I'm sorry about that. The memory of my phone filled up. This is a Ottoman commentary of Rumi's Masnavi, or parts of the Masnavi. This was a Orientalist commentary. This is a more Sufi commentary by a guy that belongs to the Rifai order, which seems to be a Shia-leaning order. I don't really have much knowledge about them, but according to my friend that is a Sufi, he says that this is a good biography. Shias are the real Ahl Sunnah by the Dajjal, the liar, Tijani. Claims to be a big Sunni scholar that even Al-Azhar sought help from, but yet couldn't answer the questions of a small child, a Shia child, and therefore converted to Shiism. And he also has a debate with Sunni scholars where he can't answer a single question and just laughs. Shia by Allama Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Tabatabai, translated by Sayyid Hussein al-Nasr. The story of the book goes basically that Hussein Nasr is in the West and they want a book about Shiism by a Shia, so he asks Tabatabai to write the book, and he basically translated Milestone by Sayyid Qutb, which has a bunch of extra texts that are banned in the UK, which I won't talk about any more, but if you recognize the cover, you know what's in it, and that's exactly the reason why I bought it, to see what these banned texts are about. Superstition as an ideology in Iranian politics, from Majlisi to Ahmadinejad, by Ali Rahnama, the same guy that wrote this book by Sangilaji, where he basically talks about how superstition has been used from the time of Majlisi to Ahmadinejad to political, further some people's political goals. East and West by René, Questions and Answers on Islam, Part 1. Terrible book, where he basically talks about how gender mutilation is Islamic, and I don't understand why it was even translated, published for a Western audience. The oldest known Malay manuscript, a 6th century Malay translation of Aqaid al-Nasafi by Alatas, gifted to me by a friend. Same with this one, Islam, the Concept of Religion and the Foundation of Ethics and Morality by Attaz. Attaz was a scholar that Hamza Yusuf praised, so I said why not buy it and see what it has to say. Medieval India under Muhammadan Rule by Stanley Lane Poole, the same guy that wrote the Moors of Spain. Medina Arabic course, everyone knows about it. The Cream of Arabic. Traveling in Pursuit of Knowledge by Khatib al-Baghdadi. Difference between advising and shaming, Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali. Great read, recommend every Muslims that are active in dawah to read it, because usually people shame one another instead of actually advising, and they're doing it to boost their ego. Don't Be Sad, gifted to me by a friend. Astrology, True or False, a Scientific Evaluation. The Glimpse of Natural Balagha by Shahid Murtaza Mutaharrihi, which basically he talks about Natural Balagha, and it seems to be a genuine scholar. He was a friend, or not a friend, but a supporter of Haydar Ali Qalamdaran. That was actually someone that refuted Imamism and Imamat, and was a friend of Ayatollah Burqi and Muhammad Tabatawi. Both of them got martyred, or all three of them, Burqi, Murtaza Mutahari and Qalamdaran, all three, but Qalamdaran and Burqi were martyred by the government. Another book by Tijani, Ask Those Who Know, Shabai Pishabar, as they say in Farsi, The Peshawar Nights, which is a book about basically a debate between a Sunni and Shia scholar, which has actually no historical evidence that it actually took place. And according to some research, they're using references that it didn't even exist at the time of the event debate when it supposedly happened. So yeah, it's a really bad book. And then I was guided by Tijani on basically how he was guided to Tashayyu. Lessons on Islamic Belief by Muhammad Ali Shomali, which is I think representative of Ali Khamenei in UK. Imam Shamil, terrible book. The guy doesn't even know what ethnicity Imam Shamil has, but he supposedly met the descendants of Imam Shamil and they approved of the book, and yeah, it might be good. When I read it, it seems like a bad book, not something I would recommend. Traveling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe by Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. The commentary on the 11 Contations, also Abdul Hakim Murad. Race to Paradise, an Islamic History of the Crusades, where he basically talks about the Christian conquest of Islamic land from an Islamic perspective. Great book, recommended everyone to read it. Disciplining the Soul by Ibn al-Jawzi. Men Around the Messenger, gifted to me by a friend. How to Read a Book was a book on how to read a book that Hamza Yusuf recommended it, so of course I had to get it. The fatwa regarding Qawt, Qutb, Abdal and Autad by Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. I have no idea what those things are, but it was gifted to me by a friend, so yeah. the khutbas, or not khutbas, I'm sorry, the classes of Rumi, basically his durus that was collected of his death and compiled into a book. There's also a book that is a collection of his khutbas. Malcolm X, by any means necessary. It's like the Sahih Bukhari of Malcolm X, collections of his like interviews and stuff like that. In the Heart of the West African Islamic Revival, a biography and a study of Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio. Interesting book, really interesting. Recommend everyone to read it if they want to learn about Islamic history in West Africa. Nuraniya, Babur Nama. Babur was a Indian or Persian prince, Central Asian prince, that basically started the Mughal Empire. He was a descendant of both Chinggis Khan and Timur Lenk. It's his own autobiography. Apparently he was gay or a bisexual. So yeah, interesting book if you're interested in late medieval, maybe, Islamic history or Indian history. Introduction by Salman Rushdie, the guy that Khomeini passed a fatwa on his death, said that that guy needed to die because of his book Satanic Verses. Iskander Pala Barbarossa, the story of a legend, also bought this one in Turkey. Muhammad the Greatest by Hujjatul Islam, not Hujjatul Islam maybe, but the great caller to Islam, Ahmed Didat, one of the first Islamic books I ever read. Discover Shiism by Shomali. Fahrenheit 451, which is basically a book about what would happen in a future where they burn books, basically. Sashi Tharoor, Inglorious Empire. Recommend everyone to read this if they want to know about the history of colonialism in India. Trevor Noah, Born a Crime, where he basically talks about his life as a mixed-race child in apartheid South Africa. Recommend it highly. Commentary on Al-Ajrumiyyah, How to Win a Debate, Arabian Night, The Shah, excellent biography of the Shah of Iran. Recommend it. The Diary of Malcolm X, which was recently published or a couple of years ago. It was actually lost and then found in an auction after it was stolen from like the box where all of Malcolm X's belongings were in the FBI. Someone stole it from there and basically sold it to a dealer, and suddenly it was found and they published it. It's interesting read. It basically all his notes from his travels around Africa and the Middle East. Conversion to Islam in the medieval period, where it published by Harvard University Press by Richard V. Bullitt. Basically, he has taken the names of scholars in biographies to see when they might have, like, the people might have converted to Islam. He goes through in the beginning, like, exactly how he did it and how his parents were mathematicians, and yeah, how he came up, like, how he figured out, like, when Muslims or Iranians and Arabs or Turks and they convert to Islam, and what happened that year that might have caused people to convert in God's path. Basically a book on the Muslim conquest of the Middle East, an atheist or Orientalist book. Imam Nawawi's Fourth Hadith by notes by Ibn Uthaymeen. The Beginning of Guidance, Imam Ghazali's The Path to Sufism. The Burning Edge, great book, recommended, by Bald and Bankrupt, before he was famous, where he basically talks about his travel in Belarus. This book, The Islamic Revolution of Khomeini by Mubarak Puri. I don't know what to say about it. Basically, the editor was lazy because he used the Lebanese version of Khomeini's books to for references instead of finding the English, like what it says in the English translations. and point out like it in the Hamid Algar translations of maybe Islamic State by Khomeini or Islamic Governance by Khomeini, what page like the quote is from, if you understand me. He used the Lebanese one that Mubarak Puri himself used. Reading the Muslim Mind was giving away, they gave away this book in the mosque, so I said why not take it and see what it's about. The biography of Ali ibn al-Hussein, Zain al-Abidin, recommended by Abdullah al-Rabat. This is also interesting book, Treatise on Disputation and Argumentation. Hamza Tzortzis, the Greek convert to Islam, recommended this book. And it's basically an Ottoman manual on argumentation. So I said, why not buy it? Farsi readings, basically training guide for how to read Farsi better. Purifying the Heart by Hamza Youssef. Basically, it's a commentary on how to purify the heart with a translation and commentary by Hamza Youssef. Anti-Tech Revolution, Why and How, Technology Slavery, and the Unabomber Manifesto. All three books are by the Unabomber. Really, really interesting, good material, especially for dawah purposes, because this is a critique of modernity, and usually I like critique modernity and I bring like the Islamic alternative to technology and modernity. And alhamdulillah, I had a roommate while in uni that actually converted to Islam without me ever talking really about Islam, but by just me critiquing the Western way of life and modernity. Great book. Buying Buddha selling Rumi. I saw it on Twitter, had to buy it, haven't had time to read it, but it seems to be like a continuation of Orientalism and talk about how Western spirituality is stealing and appropriating Islamic or Hindu Buddhist spirituality, and like repackaging it. A Literary History of Persia by Edward G. Brown, great reference book on Iranian history. A Heartfelt Advice to a Friend, given to me by a friend, Izar al-Haq, which is a book that started Ahmadida's journey of knowledge. Basically, it's a refutation of Christianity. Purifying the Heart, which is a book that was it's a book that I had to stop reading because it was like he really exposes your heart. It's a collections of things from Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim, and Sheikh Abul Islam. I don't know who that is, but it's a great book. I recommend everyone to read it to purify one's heart. From Isfahan to Medina, In Search of Truth, a biography of Salman al-Farsi. Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi's Forgotten Message, bought this in Turkey. It has some crazy Sufi stories about how Sadia Shirazi rode his flying mat across the lake to pray, and Sultan Muhammad al-Fat by Dr. Salabi. Terrible academic work. I don't know if the original is as bad, but the English translations barely has any references. It has like tafsir by Sayyid Qutb instead of and has Quranic verses instead of talking about the academic and factual life of Muhammad al-Fat. But and it's reference to encyclopedias and modern works of the book instead of manuscripts and historical documents. The Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, an old copy with when it was yellow. There is one with a more beautiful cover. It's the same translation, but it just has it's a newer edition. It has a more beautiful cover, but I like the yellow one. It feels more Islamic. Ibn Fadlan, a book everyone should read, especially the one published by Penguin, because it includes a bunch of other travel books by Muslim travelers. The Message by Muhammad Ramadan, The Siege of Mecca, which is basically a book about what happened when Johiman and his friends took over Mecca. This is a modern commentary of Rumi, The Treasure of Rumi. The Muslims in Spain by Stanley Lane Poole. I read it, and it was basically this book that started my interest in Stanley Lane Poole's work. The autobiography of Malcolm X, and this tiny book on the travels of Ibn Battuta. Tiny book with like golden pages. Let's go here. Common Sense Investing, basically a book on how to invest like in the S&P 500. Jaquan Ilul, Propaganda, Fedai Guerrillas Speak on Armed Struggle in Iran. Basically, it's a collection of essays on by Iranian communists. Think, a book on philosophy. Predictably Irrational, which is a book on behavioral economics, I think it's called. It's a really interesting. It talks about how like things we think is rational is actually irrational, and how the like salespeople trick us and stuff like that. I'm listening to the audiobook right now. I recommend it highly. Man's freedom under his servitude to Allah. Basically talks about Qadr. I think it's Jesus on the picture, like the cover. I'm not sure. I think it's him. But yeah. Let's see if I can do this here. This is This is the like pictures and poetry of Hafiz, I think. This book was gifted to me, Islamic Sciences by Hussein Nasr, an illustrated study, where it basically have like a bunch of pictures and talk about Islamic sciences and stuff like that. This is a book, collections of like formerly secret papers and documents by the American and British government on Reza Shah. Like the author hates Islam and he's really like looking for faults in Islam when he like attacks Islam whenever he has the chance, but whenever he shuts up and just talks about the documents, it's good. But for some reason he feels the need to talk about Islam all the time in the book, which is like, it's a shame. Now we go down here to my old book collection. The first one is by Paul Schmitz, Islam, the Superpower of Tomorrow, which was published maybe 100 years ago and for some reason was translated into Swedish. This one, a beautiful cover, amongst Persians Mohammedans, or Saracens maybe you can translate that too, which is basically a Christian manual to missionary in Iran. And it talks about the first Iranian missionaries that was sent to Iran at the time of Nader Shah, as when they first reached the area controlled by Iran that the Kurds lived in, the Kurds stripped them of the clothes and robbed them. So it's interesting, and it also has some interesting historical pictures of Iran and talks about different peoples group and religions and everything. And he mentions that they actually converted some guy to Christianity that worshipped Ali and saw him as a god, Ali, the cousin of the Prophet. This one here, by Knut Holmberg. Let's see if we can focus. Here we go. Which is called The Desert is Burning. It's a Danish convert to Islam, maybe 100 years ago. And he talks about his travel and how he converted to Islam and everything. While going on Hajj, he's actually killed on the way. So this book, it's by Willy Falkman, on the tracks after Knut Holmboe, we basically try to find out what happened to him. I don't know if this one is translated to English, but this one definitely is translated to English. I've been talking a lot. A Year Among the Persians. This is basically a book about the year Edward G. Brownie took to work on, find the literature and work on and stuff for this book. He basically talks about he basically spent a year collecting material for this book, and this is about the year, that 1 year. Hitler's Table Talk, a book about a Swedish guy that was taken as a slave by Muslims. It basically is autobiography and time in slavery. Let's see here. The Death Note, the Pokemon manga that isn't like for kids, where Pokemon dies and there are bloody battles and how you imagine Pokemon being if it was real. And the first volume of Dragon Ball. A bunch of random books from everything from Notes from Underground, Trump, How to Become Rich, the Book of Mormon, and yeah. Here are also a bunch of Swedish books. The only thing that is available in English is The Prophet and Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Dostoevsky. I don't know, I can't really see because it's so low if it's focused, but yeah, Dostoevsky, El Mihal, Marco Polo, 12 Rules of Life, The Silk Road, Homo Deus, Riyadh Salihin. This is basically books that are available in English and might be at interest for some of you guys. This is the Ayatollah Bourgui's book, a former Shia scholar that not really converted to Sunnism but adopted the Aqidah of Sunnis and wrote like 20 books in propagation that will try to improve Shiism, then converted and wrote 20 books in refutation of his own books. And this is one of the books he wrote in refutation of Murajaat, which is supposedly a exchange of letters that happened between a Shia scholar and the principal of Al-Azhar, Imamat and the Quran, a book about Imamat, the Quran, refutation of Imamat, a book Caliphate and its leadership by Haider al-Qalamdaran, is the refutation of Imamat. And let's see here, The Rise and Fall of Nader Shah, based on first-hand accounts from the Dutch East Indian Company. There we go. This was, alhamdulillah, all my books. I'm currently waiting for a couple of books to arrive. For example, the 3-volume Venture of Islam. I'm waiting for a French philosopher convert to Islam and his refutation of Zionism. I'm waiting for that one to arrive. What else? Yeah, and a French doctor that has written on the origins of man and science in the Quran. So I'm basically waiting for 4 books to arrive, but I thought might as well do this book review. Here are a bunch of my books I have class that is related to my studies in religious studies at a Western Orientalist university. The books are crap. I don't even bother trying to find them because they suck. And it's better to just read proper, good English, maybe even Islamic literature if you want to learn about Islam. You won't learn anything from these books. And I haven't learned anything at university. Maybe because I've read all of these books, but I haven't learned anything. It was just a waste of time studying religious studies. But alhamdulillah, living in Sweden is free. So living in Sweden and studying at uni is free. So I didn't pay anything it's paid for the books. Anyways, I'm rambling on, and this is becoming a really long video. So yeah, I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and Salam Aleykom wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.